The season is somehow almost halfway over for Oregon football, and the recruiting visits have been piling up. So, who are the names to watch for that might be future Ducks? Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Please like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show. Thank you to everybody out there who has done so already. Today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Bet Online has covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Bet Online is where the game starts. And when we want to talk recruiting, we start and end by bringing on John Garcia Jr., as we have done once again today, the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. We are in the season, but that doesn't mean recruiting stops, does it, John?
Not quite, Spencer. And in fact, it picks up for a lot of programs. So, it definitely does not slow down until pen meets paper on signing day.
And Oregon's had plenty of visitors rolling through campus on game days. Most recently, this past weekend against Stanford, there were a few guys there. I just want to start big picture, John. When students or future potential students, I should say, are coming on campus for visits during the season, how is that different for both the athlete and the coaching staff than the off season?
In the off season, it's really about everyone, right? I mean, there's time. It's kind of your own schedule, right? The coaches are putting out the dates that they're going to work out, the camps, all those things, and you can really kind of build it as you see fit. But during the season, Spencer, it's really about the games, and it's really a time where these coaching staffs flex their support and resourceful muscles because everyone else is dealing with these recruits until the coaches do. So for instance, if you're on a normal unofficial game day visit, you might get to Eugene 3 hours before kickoff. Maybe there's some type of meal in addition to a brief tour and jersey presentation if you want to throw on some funky, awesome Nike uniform. And then that's kind of it until we get closer to game time. So maybe a coach can pop in at that front, but most likely you're not going to see the coaches until after the game ends. So you might have been on campus for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours until you get that one-on-one time with an Adrian Clem or a Dan Lanning or whoever it may be. So it's a totally different scenario. And I think it's also a good self-awareness tool for these recruits. If you're getting time with coaches during the season, you are certainly a relative priority. It's a little bit different for official visits. You do get 48 hours on campus, so there is a little bit more intimacy between the recruit and the coaches, but typically game day visits in particular, there's a lot going on. These coaches are game planning, they're checking the injury report, they're making sure their guys are ready to go for the game, they're doing their media obligation. There's so much that goes into it that there's really not a lot of time to recruit. So again, if you get time on an unofficial visit with a coach at the school you're visiting, it means they think you're pretty good.
Over the weekend, Oregon had a few players on campus. I want to ask you about each of them. One of whom surprised me. I heard on the grapevine that Jonte Cook was on Oregon's campus for the Stanford game. Not a bad showing for the offense. I mean, Bo Nix only threw for 160 yards, but maybe Jonte was watching and going, would have been 200 if I'd been out there. Okay, you never know. But this guy is committed to Texas right now, and Oregon had him on campus. What are you hearing there?
Yeah, surprise to me as well, Spencer. Definitely not something we were tapping into during the official visit weekend prep, but that's the beauty of it, right? I mean, these schools that are among the best recruiting, and look, Oregon's been there. This looks like it's going to be a continuation under Dan Lanning. You not only recruit the guys that you're having committed and that you want to get committed, but even those that are committed elsewhere. And Jonte Cook was a priority for this staff before he committed to Texas. I believe Oregon and Michigan were the other schools that were the finalists for him. So yeah, you expect that relationship to continue, but the visit is a whole nother level. That's a whole nother tangible level of interest from the prospect himself. Obviously, he's from the state of Texas. He's a wide receiver. He's tight with Arch Manning. All of those things are going to be tough to beat for Oregon, but I believe this is his first visit to a school not named Texas since he made that verbal commitment to Steve Sarkisian. So that combined with what Oregon is always expected to be offensively with that type of dynamic prospect, it is always something to think about, especially if that interest is communicated and it continues here going forward. So not anything Texas fans are freaking out about just yet. But naturally, when a big time commit like that makes another visit, it certainly makes you perk your eyebrows up just a little bit, and that was kind of my reaction to seeing Jonte Cook make the trip up to Oregon. So something to keep an eye on. Obviously, the Ducks have their own elite quarterback committed in Dante Moore, the number one player in the country. So it's definitely something to watch. Those two have overlapped on multiple fronts, on multiple venues as well. So certainly elite recruits always talk and communicate. You would expect maybe Dante to be reaching out to Jonte just a little bit more here going forward.
The Dante to Jonte connection is
Never
just
said that sentence in my life.
tailor made for television. That's all that I will say should Jonte Cook somehow see this video. So it's not, of great interest quite yet, but it's just worthy of a little side eye, right? Just kind of like, what's going on over there? He was here, just something to follow along. And Cook, by the way, a 5-star wide receiver prospect, smaller, right, big speed, works primarily out of the slot. Think, Chris Hudson, that kind of role. And, if Oregon were to make that flip, it would obviously be huge for the recruiting rankings. But then they'd have 2 5-star receivers in the same class. And again, that's a huge if right now. But that would be pretty significant, right?
100%. Look, if you told Oregon fans 10 days ago, hey, Jonte Cook is committed to Texas, but the school that's the biggest threat to UT is UO, I think every Duck fan would be like, oh, really? And then they would take it, right? So I think tangibly, that's where the Ducks sit at this point as the true top threat to Texas. Now, how much of a threat, that remains to be seen. But look, signing days, still 2+ months away at this point. A lot can change. And Jonte is a kid who has fluctuated, right? He's a kid who's been recruited for a very long time. He's long been identified as one of these elite prospects. And at different points in his recruitment, other programs held some buzz, whether it was Alabama, Texas A&M, Florida for a brief, or LSU, I should say, for a brief period of time. As you mentioned, he took an official to Oregon in the offseason, Michigan as well. So this thing has bounced around a little bit before. So something to keep an eye on here going forward with, again, one of the best prospects at his position.
Yeah, very, very twitchy, explosive athlete at the slot wide receiver position. Another guy who Oregon had on campus recently, and this is a position that they continue to recruit and will need to, not just because of the players they will lose after this season, but just because of overall positional need. The defensive line is there, and Oregon's got a couple guys at that position. Terence Green among them, with several others in the 2023 cycle. But a name we've thrown out a little bit here on the show when we've recorded them together, John, is Johnny Bowens, a 4-star defensive lineman. What are you hearing there? Because he was also on campus over the weekend for a visit.
Right. And this was an official visit. So I think this, it shows you a little bit more of where Oregon can make a move for a prospect like this. And another Texan, by the way. So obviously continued, efforting for the Ducks in the Lone Star State. But look, Bowens is a big, interior defensive lineman, a guy who has been linked mostly to the schools in that region. It's kind of like when we talk about with David Hicks, who was since committed to Texas A&M, which maybe that's good news here for the Ducks. It's like Oklahoma, Texas A&M, and then Oregon is this wild card, dark horse school sitting by itself. Kind of the same feel for Bowens, right? A lot of people expect him to stay relatively close to home, but yet and still there's this continued Oregon interest. I know some other verbal commitments for the Ducks that were able to make the trip to Eugene were kind of heavy on his trail. I think Turner put out a couple photos like, hey, we need to get this guy, on board here. So he spent time with a lot of other recruits, many of which are already committed to play for the Ducks. So I think that's certainly good news at this stage of the game. And you just start to wonder, right? A&M is heating up, loading up on the defensive line again for the second straight cycle. If they were kind of the early favorite for Bowens, how much does that David Hicks commitment start to narrow that board for the Aggies? So timing here, I think, was really good for Oregon to get him on campus.
More players to talk about, including a couple of offensive linemen who are on campus to watch Oregon run all over the Stanford Cardinal on Saturday at Autzen Stadium, which we will get to. I have to remind you that our partners at Nissan have worked with us to create a new segment across the Locked On College Network titled Thrilling Moments, where we highlight the most exciting play from Oregon's weekend game or throughout the history of the University of Oregon, perhaps. But this week's thrilling moment from the team is I thought about going with Bo Nix's long touchdown run here, but I'm going with Chase Cota taking the 47-yard screen pass to the house. His first touchdown as a Duck. It comes in Autzen Stadium. His dad played at the University of Oregon, and Cota has been sensational as Oregon's probably most reliable target after Troy Franklin for Bo Nix this year. That screen pass was really well executed, and he flashed the speed that made him a solidly rated four-star prospect coming out of high school, took it all the way to the house, and just ran away from Stanford, as Oregon did in that game. That is this week's thrilling moment in college football, brought to you by Nissan. The thrilling designs behind the new lineup from Nissan are intended to empower drivers and vehicles as capable as the driver themselves. When I think of unbelievable abilities on the field for this week's thrilling moment, it has to be the aforementioned touchdown from Bo Nix to Chase Cota. This segment has been inspired by the thrilling new designs featured across Nissan's new lineup of vehicles. Pursue what thrills you in the all-new Frontier, Armada, or Pathfinder today, available now at nissanusa.com. So let's go to the offensive lineman, John, and then we'll circle around to Roderick Pleasant. But Oregon's still without an offensive line commit in the class of 2023. It's certainly the biggest hole at that particular position in the recruiting class, with the first signing period just over a couple months away, which is pretty crazy to think about
Yep.
that it is indeed that close. I'm sure it's busy season where you are. Hopefully you've still got enough time to spend some time with your newborn son, but things are definitely heating up and will continue to do so in the coming months. But the offensive linemen we talked about were both on campus. Spencer Fano, the four-star from the state of Utah, and then Iapani Lalaulu, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, whose older brother Fiope is already on Oregon's roster. They were both on campus over the weekend. What does that mean for their recruitment and where Oregon stands with each of them individually?
Well, look, we've talked about, really since the staff came together, some of the really, superstars within the coaching staff. And I think, Adrian Clem has kind of carved out his own grouping in that regard, but it hasn't quite translated yet in the verbal commitment front for this 2023 cycle, even though he finished 2022 about as well as you possibly could have. So I think these two guys, in one way, shape, or form, are going to be a part of the breakthrough. I think with Fano, it's a little bit more clear. Four programs still in the mix: BYU, Utah, and Michigan, in addition to the Oregon Ducks. We did get some confirmation finally that he will take that final trip out to Michigan. So it will be a true, all things even type of battle where he does visit all the schools that are heavy on his list. By that point, he will have taken official visits to every school except for BYU. But that's the local school, and that's the school that he's most familiar with. So understandably, he doesn't have to take that official visit to feel like he has enough information on the local Cougars there. But I think the most important part of Fano getting on campus this weekend was not only the time with Clem, which is obvious, but his family, right? They are able to experience Eugene. He told Blair Angulo of 24/7 Sports that the final questions they had about Oregon were answered. And I think that is so important in trying to figure out where you want to play college football, right? Because the optics of it are obvious, the history, all that stuff you can look up, right? And obviously your relationship with the coaches is what it is. But there's certain elements of the recruiting process that you have to just go experience. So I think him and his family getting out there were really important. And I think it's starting to push towards more of a Pac-12 narrative in this recruitment, which normally wouldn't be a big deal, but when only half of the top four is in the Pac-12, it does feel like it's a big deal in this case. So there is a sense that Oregon and Utah could be pulling out front here. Before, and I know last week we talked about, hey, with the BYU angle, early buzz, local school, all of that. But the counter to that is, hey, if you've always known you were going to go to BYU, why aren't you committed just yet, right? So I think there was some truth to maybe the delay in making a college decision, which inevitably opened the door for Oregon, Utah, and Michigan to make its way through. So we'll see. Michigan's got their trip coming up, and they'll shoot their shot. And look, that's a unique program, obviously very different than some of the others that we've mentioned. So we'll see if it's a good kind of different for Fano and his family. But as things sit right now, you got to feel like he's probably Pac-12 bound, and the recency bias pushes it towards the Oregon Ducks. So really important to get him on campus.
Yeah, and that's just a position that Oregon has dominated at so far here in
Even going
2022.
into Utah, right? Yeah.
Right, right, which is about what we expected on the field, but now it's about building that next unit because Adrian Clem deserves a lot of credit for the way this offensive line has played, but I don't think it's a full test of his abilities as an offensive line coach at the college level because these are not guys he recruited, and these aren't even guys that he coached and developed into the players they are today. It's a little bit, frankly, like Dan Lanning. It's a plug and play situation where there's some element of newness there, and Marcus Harper is a guy who hadn't played a lot but has filled in really well at the left guard position, and their assignments are good, their blitz pickups, and all that stuff is Adrian Clem. But TJ Bass is an NFL caliber offensive lineman. Alex Forsyth might be as well. Big Sala was absolutely wrecking dudes on Saturday, and I think I might have been able to have been his offensive line coach, and he would have been able to push Stanford around the field. It's not to say that I don't like Clem. I think the early returns are quite good, but developing that next unit and figuring out who those essential guys are going to be outside of Josh Connerly, who will be the next left tackle once TJ Bass goes on to the NFL, is I think going to be the biggest test there. But Fano, a guy that I certainly hope Oregon is able to have in the mix, because I feel like an offensive line, John, I wonder if you feel this way as well. You want to have as many bodies as possible. That's true at any position, but what position group gets hurt more than the offensive line? You get dinged up here and there. You can wear down as the season goes on. I think linebacker and running back, the only ones to me that always seem comparable, but you got to have guys to fill in, because if you have a big drop off from your first unit to your second unit on the offensive line, it can really hurt you in certain games throughout the course of a season.
Yeah, it's a great point, Spencer. Look, five are always on the field, sometimes more than that if you go unbalanced or goal line, what have you. So, yeah,
Oregon's been putting 7 out there sometimes.
when you need that many big bodies in particular, yeah, it's always important to have as many as possible at your disposal. And look, college football seasons aren't getting any shorter, right? You know, expansion's on the way. I mean, this thing is going to be much closer to that NFL model, you know, before all is said and done. So yeah, the more bodies up front, the better. And I think that's where these guys could potentially be complementary pieces, right? You expect Connerly to be the guy at left tackle, so do I. Who wouldn't at this point? But now Fano, maybe he's a right tackle candidate, and these other guys are built to play more on the interior as well. So I think that's another part of it. It's not just, hey, let me go get all the highest rated offensive linemen, but do they work together? Are they complementary in body type, style, experience, their timelines? How soon can they actually contribute for the Ducks in a Pac-12 type game, not an FCS opponent or some spring practice, spring scrimmage, and an actual Pac-12 game where a lot is on the line. Can these guys contribute? All of that factors into the offensive line or any position coach. So yeah, a lot to be desired at this point for Clem, but I do think he's going to get the benefit of the doubt in figuring that out. But it has to that path has to run through these two guys before all is said and done.
I want to go to the other side of the ball on the recruiting front, and we'll close with Oregon's latest verbal commitment there, because that is Jaden Moore, which is always noteworthy when you add someone else to the class. But Oregon right now will have a glaring need in going into 2023 in the secondary, because Christian Gonzalez, I don't know how much you've watched of him, but we Duck fans have seen quite a bit of him and are I think, wise enough to realize that guy's going to the NFL after the season because he looks the part, he plays the part. And then the second cornerback slot is a little bit of a weakness. So I really want to see Oregon bring in as many highly rated corners as they can, not just because Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy, I think, kind of set that expectation and standard for us, but because after this year, if you take Christian Gonzalez out of the secondary, I don't think, and you're not going to have Bennett Williams or Jamal Hill either, there are just going to be a lot of holes on the back end of that Oregon defense from a roster perspective. And they've got Caleb Presley. He's still committed. He's Oregon's highest rated defensive player in 2023. Cole Martin is in there as well at the cornerback slot. He's a little more of a nickel or dime guy, but name to start watching out for as the first signing day is just over 2 months away is Roderick Pleasant, who's a high 4-star recruit. Oregon has a visit scheduled for him that's in November. Do you think it's likely he'll take that visit having verbally committed somewhere, or do you think he'll still be uncommitted at that time? And now I'm really intrigued by your answer after seeing your little grin there.
Well, he's a kid who's on the up and up, right? I think there's a lot of different ways recruits go into this part of recruiting season, decision making season, right? You're either well established, right? You've kind of been there, you've done that. You're a Josh Connerly, and you're just like, hey, I can take my time, right? I can do this kind of whenever, and all these options will be there. And then on the flip side, there's the guys who rise kind of every single time that someone checks in on them. And I think that's where Pleasant sits at this point because he's coming off of an unbelievable offseason on the track circuit, right? 10-1-4 in the 100-meter dash, legal, no wind aided, all that stuff. I mean, just an absolute blazer on the outside. So naturally, when you do things like that in the spring, your summer, and eventually your fall is going to get quite busy. So he's added some scholarship offers, and some new schools and contenders are trying to make moves here. So I think that's why it's big that Oregon's already got this visit set for later in the process, right? Like you said, it's a November visit. It's going to be towards the end of the season, so naturally closer to signing day. And I think that's where a kid like this kind of settles, right? You know, he's going to see, hey, how high is my ceiling from a recruiting standpoint? Who really jumps all in here before all is said and done? But obviously, Oregon has done enough to establish enough interest to garner that official visit, which is really critical at this stage of the process. And I'm not sure he's taken a whole bunch at this point. I think one summer trip to Boston College. I think Wisconsin got involved, but of course they just fired their head coach. So we'll see how that plays out. Cal, a couple other Pac-12 schools are getting involved as well, but only one OV in the books as of right now. So the battle is going to become not for Oregon, for the others. Who else can grab one of these official visits? Because naturally, with a late riser in particular, he's probably not a kid you've had on campus a bunch of times. He's probably not a kid as familiar with your school outside of maybe some in the state of California, you know, where he plays ball. So naturally, I do think he's a kid that's going to have a lot more interest here going forward. And the battle for those official visits is going to be just as contested as his actual verbal commitment one day. But the Ducks have been right at the forefront of his emergence, and they got that visit locked in pretty early. So I think all of that, you know, points to the Ducks absolutely staying in that race until the end.
One more defensive guy we've got to talk about, Oregon's most recent verbal commitment in the class of 2023. But first, we remind you that this episode brought to you by Bet Online, your number one source for football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, Bet Online remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball, Go Mariners, MMA, boxing, my personal favorite, golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts. By the way, I just want to throw this out there. The number of years that the Mariners made the playoffs in my life is that I can remember is now up to one. And it coincides with the same year that I have been reading those Bet Online promos here on the show and throwing in the little Go Mariners in there. So years
Manifestation.
that is exactly what I'm saying. I have the power to speak it into existence. I just want you all to be aware of the sort of mythical powers Mike Leach should have given me in that illustrious mascot battle press conference. I think that's kind of where I'm at. I also have the power to be the world's biggest jinx. But let's go to a more optimistic look and perhaps realistic look at the news, and that is Jaden Moore is the latest Oregon verbal commit in the class of 2023. He's one of several players on the defensive line now. I think it's pretty clear the staff is prioritizing that position, not just because it's how they want to build the team, but also because you have a lot of guys who are playing this year who are not going to be back next year. We'll see if Popo Amavai is able to get a medical redshirt or if he wants to come back or chooses to go to the NFL. Brandon Dorless could have another year, but that guy's a monster. He's going to the league as well. DJ Johnson's playing his last year of college football. I think we're seeing that play out in the 2023 recruiting cycle right now because Jaden Moore is an edge prospect. You've got Tatum Tuiotti's an edge prospect. Tavita Pamee and Mikhail Gardner are both 3-star defensive linemen. And then once you get into the 4-star ranks, you've got Blake Purchase, a 4-star edge, Terence Green, and then Amari Washington is the highest rated defensive lineman to this point. So Moore, not the flashiest prospect, John, but much like offensive line, if you get enough of these guys, one or two are going to become good players at least early in their careers, and Moore certainly has the physical traits to do that. But what have you seen from him that makes him an intriguing prospect for Oregon on the defensive side of the ball?
Well, you mentioned the frame, right? 6'4", 225. It kind of smacks you in the face. It's kind of like how you draw up the modern edge rusher, right? A guy who you could probably add enough weight to if you do need to move him around a little bit, or he's one who could stay relatively trim and stay on the edge where he is really most comfortable. I mean, this is a guy who loves to play stand-up football. He does it on the edge very consistently and shows a really nice motor and a first step on top of it. I think the technique has some room to grow, but how much does this guy love standing up, Spencer? When he moves inside, which his high school does relatively frequently, he's rushing guards and centers from a stand up 2-point stance on the defensive line. It's just not something we see every day, but he's so quick that it's effective. There are times and samples on his tape where these guards aren't even getting a hand on him before he's swimming over them and making a
Reminds
play
me,
towards.
just sorry to interrupt briefly, but the last edge prospect that we saw at Oregon who could stand up and rush on the interior now
Mhm.
plays for the New York Giants. Not saying Moore's that kind of prospect, doesn't look like he is right now because that's a high bar, but that's the sort of speed you're saying he displays.
He does. The quickness off the snap is there. Obviously, Kayvon is in his own stratosphere in Oregon lore, and that's something we'll talk about maybe forever here going forward. But
Yeah.
with more, you see enough quickness to raise your own eyebrow. And look, it takes a confidence to do that. There's just not a lot of guys who have the what to go in there with a 2-point stance, knowing if I'm off balance here, I'm done. Right, because I'm not in a wide base 3-point stance. I'm in a 2-point stance. So if I get hit just the right way, I'm on my tail. And now all of a sudden it's a huge play for the other team. So it takes a confidence and a bravado to rush the passer that way. So I like the variance that he shows on tape. And then early on in his senior season, we've seen him bulk up a little bit. I think he's over 230 at this point. Looks like good weight from what I can tell right now, and still showing the strength and a nice motor to move towards the football through the whistle, which these elite blue chip, Power 5 commits don't often show. Sometimes these kids as seniors kind of take a step back. It doesn't look like Moore has done that to this point. So all positive from our standpoint, although the technique certainly could use some refinement, like we say with most of these high school trench prospects.
Real quick, John, before I let you go and get back to, I assume your son is taking a nap right now since he hasn't hasn't interrupted
He'll
the
make an
recording of the
appearance
show
soon. I have the feeling.
today. Hey, we're all here for it. Amari Washington is, I think, the most intriguing prospect at this point that Oregon's gotten on the defensive line. Other guys, you never know. Some could fade and never play a lot when they get to Eugene and are ultimately Ducks, but other guys there's an element of randomness to all of this, right? A lot of guys have
Sure.
potential, but whether or not it clicks. But to me, when I look at Amari Washington's tape, he intrigues me the most. What do you see from him?
I'm right there with you. I think he provides more balance. Certainly, the technique looks like it's hit another level. I think he is hitting the right shoulder. I think he's got a little bit more bend than Moore in particular. And I think he's got some versatility too. I think he's got a little bit more space ability and athleticism that if you do need him to run with a running back who's flaring out, or even wall off a tight end, he's got some of that potential in how balanced he plays the game as well. But I think the raw torque is also there that makes you just want to say, hey, go get the guy who's throwing the ball, and we'll be good with that.
Always great to have John Garcia Jr. on, the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. All the recruiting insight you could ever need right here on the show. John, good to talk to you as always, my friend.
Likewise, boss. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.